The main hall of the lodge was transformed into a stage for the ritual. The storekeeper, whose name they finally learned was Eric Hansen, worked with an intensity that left no room for questions. He moved quickly, drawing intricate symbols on the floor with chalk and pouring lines of salt in precise patterns. Around the salt circle, he placed candles at equal intervals, their flames flickering in the cold, heavy air. "Stay inside the circle," Eric instructed, his voice sharp and commanding. "No matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, do not step outside it." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The others exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, their fear a palpable weight in the room. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation and something darker, an oppressive energy that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "What do we do?" Lucas asked, clutching the leather-bound journal Eric had given him. The pages were filled with ancient runes and diagrams, their meanings only half understood. "You read," Eric replied, lighting the last of the candles. "I'll guide you, but once we start, it won't stop until it's over." "And if it doesn't work?" Tom asked, his voice tight. Eric didn't answer immediately. He looked up from the circle, his eyes dark and weary. "Then it won't matter." As the preparations were finalized, the lodge seemed to come alive around them. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, their movements unnatural and disjointed. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in the icy air. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the building, shaking the walls and sending shivers down their spines. "It's starting," Eric said grimly. He stepped into the circle, motioning for the others to join him. They obeyed, huddling together as he began to chant in a low, rhythmic voice. The words were foreign, their syllables harsh and guttural, but they seemed to resonate with the air itself. Vibrating through the room, Lucas opened the journal, his hands trembling as he began to read aloud. The runes on the page seemed to shift and shimmer as he spoke, the ancient language rolling awkwardly off his tongue. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching unnaturally high. The growling grew louder, more insistent, as if the lodge itself were protesting the ritual. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, forming grotesque shapes that loomed over the group. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to stay inside the circle. "Don't stop," Eric commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's trying to scare you. Focus." Suddenly, the growling stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Then, without warning, the room was plunged into darkness as the candles were snuffed out. Emily gasped, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she tried to illuminate the room. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the others standing frozen in fear. Eric's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stay in the circle." A deafening roar erupted from the shadows, shaking the very foundation of the lodge. The air grew icy, and a foul stench filled the room, making them gag. Emily's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw it, the creature. It stood just beyond the edge of the circle, its towering form cloaked in darkness. Its eyes burned like molten coals, and its gnarled, clawed hands reached toward them. "Keep reading," Eric shouted, his voice strained as he continued to chant. Lucas's voice faltered, but he forced himself to keep going, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. The runes on the floor began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with the rhythm of the chant. The creature roared again, slamming its claws against the invisible barrier of the circle. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the room, knocking Sarah to the ground. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. "It's breaking through," she cried. "Focus," Eric barked. "The circle will hold as long as we stay together. Do not break the connection." The group linked hands, their grips tight and trembling as the creature continued to batter the barrier. The glowing runes grew brighter, their light blinding, and the air filled with a deafening hum that seemed to resonate in their bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating like a receding wave. The group remained frozen, their breaths ragged and shallow, as they waited for the next attack. But it didn't come. "It's gone," Eric said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He sank to his knees, his face pale and drenched in sweat. For now, the others collapsed to the floor, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. Emily leaned back against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. What was that?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Eric didn't answer immediately. He stared at the glowing runes on the floor, his expression grim. "That was only the beginning," he said finally. "It's not defeated. We've only bought ourselves time." "What do you mean?" Tom demanded, his voice rising in anger. "We did everything you said. We followed the ritual. Why isn't it over?" "Because this thing is older than the lodge," Eric said, his voice heavy with regret. "Older than the mountains. It's not just a spirit or a demon. It's something much worse. The people who summoned it didn't create it. They just woke it up." "Then how do we stop it?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. "For good." Eric hesitated, his gaze flicking to the journal in Lucas's hands. "There's one more ritual," he said finally, "but it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've done so far." "Of course it is," Sarah muttered, her voice bitter. "Why wouldn't it be?" "The final ritual requires a direct confrontation," Eric continued. "We have to lure it into a binding circle, trap it completely, but it won't come willingly. It will fight, and it will try to destroy us before we can finish." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Eric's words settling heavily over them. Emily clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "Then we fight," she said firmly. "We don't have a choice." Eric nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'll need to prepare. It'll come for us tonight." The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Eric guided the group through the preparations, drawing new symbols on the floor and gathering every bit of salt, herbs, and candles they could find. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the oppressive energy returned, stronger than before. By the time night fell, the lodge was alive with a malevolent presence. Shadows writhed on the walls, whispers echoed through the halls, and the air buzzed with an electric tension that made their skin crawl. As the group took their places within the binding circle, Eric lit the candles and began to chant. The runes on the floor glowed brightly, their light cutting through the darkness. The creature roared from somewhere deep within the lodge, its voice shaking the walls and sending shivers down their spines. "It's coming," Eric said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Stay strong. No matter what happens, do not leave the circle." The creature appeared in the doorway, its massive form filling the space. Its eyes burned with a fiery rage, and its claws scraped against the floor as it stepped closer. The runes flared brightly, and the creature howled in pain. But it didn't stop. The final confrontation had begun. The creature stepped into the room, its towering form almost scraping the ceiling. Its shadowy body seemed to writhe and pulse, as if made of living smoke, and its glowing red eyes fixed on the group with a malevolent intensity. The candles around the binding circle flickered wildly, their flames struggling against an invisible force. The runes on the floor flared brightly, casting sharp, jagged shadows on the walls. "Don't break the circle," Eric shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of the creature's guttural growls. "No matter what, stay together." The group huddled closer, their hands trembling as they gripped each other tightly. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to stay put. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its sheer malice pressing down on them like a physical weight. The air grew colder, and the stench of decay filled the room, making them gag. The creature roared, a deafening sound that shook the walls and sent a cascade of dust raining down from the ceiling. It lunged toward the circle, its claws outstretched, but the glowing runes flared brighter, creating an invisible barrier that stopped it in its tracks. It howled in rage, its claws scraping against the barrier with an ear-piercing screech. "It's trying to break through," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "What do we do?" "Hold the connection," Eric barked, his hands moving in intricate patterns as he chanted in the ancient tongue. The runes pulsed in response, their light growing stronger. We have to weaken it before we can trap it completely. Easier said than done, Tom shouted, his eyes wide with terror as the creature continued its relentless assault on the barrier. The creature slammed its massive fists against the invisible wall, each blow sending shockwaves through the room. The candles wavered, and the circle of salt began to scatter under the force of the vibrations. Emily felt her grip on Sarah's hand falter, and she tightened it desperately. "Stay strong," Eric commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "It feeds on fear. Don't give it what it wants." The creature let out a guttural laugh, its voice deep and resonant. It spoke for the first time, its words a distorted, otherworldly growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot stop me," it snarled. "I was here long before you. I will be here long after." Emily shuddered at the sound, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to let the fear consume her. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "We'll send you back to wherever you came from." The creature roared in response, its body writhing violently as it lashed out at the barrier. The runes flickered, their glow dimming for a moment, and the creature's claws nearly broke through. "Lucas, the chant," Eric shouted. "Focus on the chant." Lucas frantically flipped through the pages of the journal, his voice trembling as he began to recite the words. The runes flared again, stronger this time, and the creature shrieked in pain, recoiling from the circle. "It's working," Sarah cried, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. But the victory was short-lived. The creature slammed its fists against the floor, and the entire lodge trembled under the force. The walls groaned, and cracks began to spiderweb across the ceiling. The oppressive energy in the room grew stronger, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. "Finish the ritual," Eric shouted, his voice strained as he continued to chant. "We're running out of time." The creature roared again, its form shifting and writhing as it fought against the binding circle. The air around it shimmered with a dark, malevolent energy, and the shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, stretching toward the group with clawed, grasping hands. Tom grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the creature, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, the shadows recoiled, but the creature lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air just inches from his face. He stumbled back, nearly breaking the circle, but Emily caught him, pulling him back into place. "Focus, Tom," she shouted. "We can't afford any mistakes." The runes on the floor began to pulse more rapidly, their light growing brighter with each repetition of the chant. Eric's voice grew louder, more commanding, as he called on the ancient forces to bind the creature. Lucas's voice faltered, but he forced himself to keep reading, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. The creature let out a deafening roar, its body writhing violently as the runes began to pull it inward. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, their movements growing more frantic as the creature's power was drained away. "We're close," Eric shouted, his voice tinged with both determination and urgency. "Keep going." The creature lunged at the circle again, its claws slamming against the barrier with a force that shook the floor. The runes flared brightly, and the creature howled in pain, its form flickering as it was pulled closer to the center of the circle. Emily tightened her grip on Sarah's hand, her heart pounding as the ritual reached its climax. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity. The candles flickered violently, their flames nearly extinguished, and the oppressive energy in the room grew almost unbearable. "Now," Eric shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Finish it." Lucas recited the final words of the chant, his voice trembling but clear. The runes on the floor erupted in a blinding light, and the creature let out a final, ear-piercing shriek as it was pulled into the center of the circle. Its form writhed and twisted, collapsing in on itself as the light consumed it. The lodge trembled violently, the walls groaning as if on the verge of collapse. The runes pulsed one last time, their light fading slowly until the room was plunged into darkness. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, The oppressive energy lifted, leaving the room feeling strangely empty. Emily opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden darkness. She could barely make out the shapes of the others around her, their breaths ragged and shallow. Eric was slumped on the floor, his face pale and drenched in sweat, but he was alive. Did we do it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Eric nodded weakly. "It's gone. For now. For now." Tom repeated, his voice rising in anger. "What do you mean? For now? We did everything you said." "We weakened it," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we didn't destroy it. Something that old, that powerful, it can't be destroyed. Not completely." Emily felt a sinking feeling in her chest. "So what happens now?" "We leave," Eric said firmly. "This place is cursed. It always will be. The best we can do is make sure no one else comes here." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Eric's words settling heavily over them. Slowly, they began to gather their belongings, their movements slow and deliberate as they processed what had just happened. As they stepped outside into the cold, pale light of dawn, the lodge loomed behind them, silent and imposing. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape blanketed in an eerie stillness. For a moment, no one spoke, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Emily didn't answer. She glanced back at the lodge, her gaze lingering on the dark, empty windows. Deep down, she knew the answer. It wasn't over. Not yet. The drive down the mountain was silent. The only sound the low hum of the truck's engine as it navigated the snow-covered roads. Eric sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his face pale and drawn. The group huddled together in the back, their expressions grim. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The lodge loomed in the distance, growing smaller with each passing mile. Emily kept her gaze fixed on it, her chest tightening as they descended further. Even as it disappeared from view, the oppressive weight of its presence lingered, an invisible tether pulling at her. "You're all lucky to be alive," Eric said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, heavy with exhaustion. "Not many people make it out of that place." "Did we really make it out?" Sarah murmured, her voice trembling. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, staring out the window at the snow-covered trees. "It doesn't feel like it's over." "It's never over," Eric replied, his tone flat. "Not with something like that." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Great. So we're just supposed to live with this forever, knowing it's still out there?" "You'll live," Eric said firmly. "And that's more than most people get." No one responded. The truck continued its slow descent, the forest closing in around them. The further they drove, the heavier the silence became, until it felt like the weight of the lodge itself was pressing down on them. By the time they reached the village at the base of the mountain, the sun had risen fully, casting a pale, golden light over the snow. The group piled out of the truck, their bodies stiff and aching from the tension of the night before. Eric stepped out last, pulling his bag from the back and slinging it over his shoulder. "This is as far as I go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll be safe here. Just don't go back." Emily turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What about you? What will you do?" Eric shrugged, his gaze distant. "What I always do. Clean up the mess." Without another word, he climbed back into the truck and drove off, leaving the group standing in the middle of the quiet village. For a long moment, they just stood there, unsure of what to do next. "We need to get home," Lucas said finally, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Back to normal." "Normal?" Sarah repeated, her tone bitter. "How are we supposed to go back to normal after everything we've seen?" Tom placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression weary but determined. "We have to try. That's all we can do." Reluctantly, the group made their way to the small train station at the edge of the village. The station was empty, its platforms covered in a thin layer of snow. They bought their tickets in silence, their movements mechanical, and boarded the first train heading south. As the train pulled away from the station, Emily leaned her head against the cold window. watching the snowy landscape blur past. Her mind was a whirlwind of fragmented memories, the roaring of the creature, the flickering runes, the suffocating darkness. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had left something unfinished. The journey home was long and uneventful. They parted ways at the central station, each heading to their respective homes with promises to stay in touch. But deep down, Emily knew they wouldn't. The bond that had held them together through their ordeal was already fraying, unraveling under the weight of their shared trauma. When Emily finally arrived at her apartment, it felt foreign to her, like a place she had never been before. The walls seemed too bright, the air too still. She dropped her bag by the door and sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For days, she barely left her apartment. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the creature's burning eyes, felt the oppressive weight of its presence. She kept the lights on at all times, unable to bear the darkness. Even the smallest shadow sent a spike of fear through her. She wasn't the only one. Lucas called her a week after they had returned, his voice shaky and uneven. Have you noticed anything strange?" he asked, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. Emily frowned, her grip tightening on the phone. "What do you mean?" "Things," Lucas said. "Shadows, noises. I think it's following us." Emily's blood ran cold. "Lucas, don't." Before she could finish, the line went dead. She tried calling him back, but the call wouldn't go through. Panic clawed at her chest as she stared at the phone, her mind racing. Over the next few days, Emily's unease grew. She began noticing small, inexplicable things. Objects would be out of place, despite her being certain she hadn't moved them. Her reflection in the mirror seemed off, as if it didn't quite match her movements. And then there were the shadows that stretched too far, lingered too long, and sometimes seemed to move on their own. One night, as she sat in her dimly lit living room, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, but it sent a chill down her spine. "You can't escape it." Her hands trembled as she typed a response. But before she could hit send, her phone screen went black. The room plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and died, leaving her alone with the oppressive silence. And then she heard it, a faint, guttural growl, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. Elsewhere, the others were facing their own battles. Tom began drinking heavily, trying to drown out the memories that haunted him. Sarah withdrew completely, cutting off all contact with the group. Lucas, desperate for answers, delved deeper into the journal they had taken from the lodge, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. But the journal offered no comfort, only more questions. The runes seemed to shift and change under his gaze, and the words began to make sense in ways they hadn't before. It was as if the journal was alive, whispering its secrets directly into his mind. One night, unable to sleep, Lucas sat at his desk, poring over the journal by the light of a flickering candle. As he turned the pages, a single word stood out, written in bold, jagged letters: Blodoffer. A chill ran down his spine. He had seen that word before, in the lodge. It meant blood sacrifice. His hands shook as he closed the journal, the candle flickering violently before snuffing out completely. In the darkness, he felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, watching him from the shadows. A month passed, and the group drifted further apart. Emily tried calling Lucas again, but his phone was disconnected. She reached out to Tom and Sarah, but they didn't answer. The isolation weighed heavily on her, amplifying her fear. One day, a package arrived at her door. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling as she peeled away the paper. Inside was a single object, a porcelain doll with a cracked face and empty, staring eyes. Clutched in its hands was a folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded it slowly, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled in red ink. "It's not finished." The lights flickered, and in the dim glow, she saw her shadow stretch unnaturally long across the floor. And from the darkness, she heard it again, the low, guttural growl that had haunted her since the lodge. This time, She knew it wasn't going away. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, the wind howling like a living thing, battering against the windows and shaking the old wooden walls of the lodge. Inside, the group huddled together in the main hall, their faces pale and eyes wide. The figure outside the window had vanished, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on all of them. Tom paced near the dying fire, his hands clenched into fists. "We need to leave. Now. I don't care if we have to walk through the storm. Staying here isn't an option." "And go where?" Emily snapped, her voice sharp with fear. "We're snowed in. The car is buried, and we'd freeze to death before we got anywhere. Better to take our chances out there than in here." Tom shot back, gesturing around the room. "This place it's wrong. You all feel it too." Lucas, seated on the floor with his back against the wall, stared at the Polaroid in his hands. It was the photo he had taken earlier, the one with the shadowy figure in the hallway. The more he looked at it, the less certain he was that it had been a trick of the light. The figure's edges were too defined, its posture too deliberate. It was watching them. "I think it's trying to scare us," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Whatever it is, it wants us afraid." "Well, mission accomplished," Sarah muttered, hugging her knees to her chest. Her gaze flicked nervously to the hallway, where the shadows seemed to shift and ripple in the flickering firelight. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Okay, let's think this through. We're not getting out tonight, so we need to focus on staying safe until morning. We stick together, keep the fire going." And a loud crash interrupted her, coming from somewhere upstairs. The sound echoed through the lodge, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the floor above them. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "Of course we heard it," Tom hissed. He grabbed the flashlight from his pack, his jaw tightening. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Lucas said, standing abruptly. "We'll check it out. Together." Reluctantly, the group followed the sound, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they climbed the staircase. Each step creaked loudly beneath their weight, the noise unnaturally amplified in the oppressive silence. At the top, they paused, listening intently. The footsteps had stopped, but a faint scraping sound echoed down the hallway. They followed the noise to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it seeming to pulse like a living thing. Lucas pushed the door open, his flashlight illuminating a large, cluttered room. It looked like an office or study, with shelves of dusty books lining the walls and a heavy wooden desk dominating the center. "What the hell is that?" Tom muttered, pointing to the far corner of the room. There, partially obscured by shadows, was a large wooden chest. Its surface was intricately carved with strange, angular symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. The chest looked old, far older than anything else in the lodge, and its presence felt deeply wrong, as if it didn't belong there. "Don't touch it," Sarah said immediately, her voice trembling. Lucas ignored her, stepping closer to inspect the carvings. "These symbols, they're the same as the ones in the basement and the kitchen, which is exactly why we shouldn't mess with it," Emily said, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what's inside, and I don't want to find out." But Lucas was already reaching for the lid. The others watched in tense silence as he hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the wood. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted the lid. The air seemed to change instantly, growing colder and heavier. Inside the chest was a collection of strange objects, broken porcelain dolls, rusted knives, and a thick, leather-bound book. The dolls were particularly unsettling, their faces cracked and their glass eyes staring blankly upward. "What is this stuff?" Tom asked, his voice low. Lucas reached for the book, pulling it out carefully. It was bound in dark leather, its cover engraved with more of the strange symbols. The pages inside were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten text and crude illustrations. Lucas flipped through it, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the strange language. "It's some kind of journal," he said finally. "Or a ritual book. I can't read most of it, but there are drawings. Look." He held up the book, showing the others a page covered in intricate diagrams. One showed the lodge itself, surrounded by jagged symbols. Another depicted a group of people standing in a circle, their faces obscured, with a dark figure towering over them. This is some kind of cult, Sarah whispered, backing away. They used this place for rituals, sacrifices. Maybe. Great, Tom said bitterly. We're trapped in a haunted lodge built by lunatics. What else could go wrong? As if in answer, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The group spun around, their flashlights darting across the room. But there was no one there. The air grew colder still, and the scraping sound returned, this time from within the chest. Get away from it, Emily said urgently, pulling Lucas back. But before they could move, the lid of the chest slammed shut on its own, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, shaking the walls and making the floorboards tremble. Run, Lucas shouted. The group bolted, their footsteps pounding down the hallway as the growl grew louder, more feral. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting as if trying to reach for them. By the time they reached the main hall, they were gasping for breath, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. We need to leave, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I don't care about the storm. We have to get out of here. But the book, Lucas began, but Emily cut him off. Screw the book. This isn't an adventure anymore. Lucas, it's survival. The growling stopped suddenly, leaving the lodge in an eerie, oppressive silence. But the group knew better than to trust the quiet. They gathered their belongings quickly, their hands trembling as they packed. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming like a banshee. As they prepared to leave, Lucas hesitated, glancing back toward the stairs. The book lay on the floor where he had dropped it, its pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen breeze. Leave it, Tom said firmly. It's not worth it. Reluctantly, Lucas turned away, and the group made their way to the door. But as they stepped outside into the storm, a deep, guttural laugh echoed from within the lodge, chilling them to their core. The house wasn't done with them yet. The storm outside seemed to grow angrier with each passing moment, the wind howling like a beast prowling through the frozen wilderness. Snow whipped against the windows in frenzied flurries, the sound a relentless hiss that burrowed into their ears. Inside the lodge, the group stood frozen in place, staring at the heavy oak door they had just locked behind them. The laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman, still echoed faintly in their minds. Emily was the first to speak, her voice trembling. What was that? No one answered. Lucas's face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line as he stared at the floor. Sarah hugged herself tightly, rocking slightly as if trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Tom finally broke the silence. We can't stay here. That thing, whatever it is, it's not going to let us just walk away. And what do you suggest? Emily shot back, her tone sharp with fear. There's a blizzard out there. We'll freeze to death before we get halfway down the mountain. Better that than whatever's waiting for us in here, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. No, Lucas said suddenly, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. We can't leave. Not yet. Tom turned on him, his fists clenched. What the hell are you talking about? Did you not hear that thing? Did you not see what just happened? I did, Lucas said, meeting his gaze. And that's exactly why we need to figure out what's going on here. If we leave now, we'll never understand what this place is, what it's trying to tell us. Trying to tell us? Emily repeated, her voice incredulous. Lucas, it's not trying to tell us anything. It's trying to kill us. Maybe, Lucas admitted, his hands trembling slightly. But if we leave without knowing, it'll haunt us forever. Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You're insane. But even as she said it, she knew he was right. Whatever was happening in the lodge wasn't just a random haunting. There was a purpose to it, a dark logic that they didn't yet understand. And deep down, she knew that leaving without confronting it would only make things worse. The group retreated to the main hall, their flashlights casting jittery beams of light across the room. The fire had gone out completely, leaving the space icy and dark. They sat close together, their breaths visible in the frigid air. "What's the plan?" Tom asked finally, his voice flat. Lucas hesitated, his gaze flicking to the book they had left on the floor. It lay open, its pages fluttering faintly in a breeze none of them could feel. "We start with the book," he said. "It's the only clue we have." Reluctantly, Emily retrieved the book and placed it on the table in front of them. The strange symbols and crude illustrations seemed to shift slightly in the flickering light of their flashlights. As if alive, Lucas flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher the text. "It's written in some kind of old Scandinavian dialect," he muttered. "I can't read most of it, but these diagrams..." He pointed to a page that depicted a circle of people surrounding a dark, towering figure. The figure's eyes were marked with jagged red lines, and its hands were outstretched as if commanding the people around it. "What does it say?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Lucas shook his head. "I don't know exactly, but it looks like some kind of ritual. A summoning." Emily's stomach dropped. "You're saying they summoned that thing?" "Maybe," Lucas said. "Or maybe it was already here, and they just woke it up." "Great," Tom muttered. "So how do we put it back to sleep?" Lucas flipped through the pages frantically, searching for an answer. He stopped on a page near the back, his eyes narrowing. The diagram on this page showed a similar ritual circle, but this time the dark figure was inside the circle, surrounded by jagged lines that seemed to form a barrier. "This," Lucas said, pointing to the page. "It's a containment ritual. I think this is how they trapped it." "Then why is it still here?" Sarah asked. "Because the ritual wasn't permanent," Lucas said. "Look, these notes here. They talk about sacrifices, blood offerings to keep the barrier intact." Tom swore under his breath. "So what happens if there's no offering?" "The barrier breaks," Lucas said grimly, "and the thing they trapped gets out." As the group absorbed this horrifying revelation, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Their flashlights flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the lodge, shaking the walls and sending a cascade of dust raining down from the ceiling. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The growl grew louder, more insistent, as if the very structure of the lodge was groaning under the weight of the sound. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible force. Suddenly, one of the windows shattered, the glass exploding inward as the wind howled through the room. The group screamed, ducking for cover as shards of glass rained down around them. When the chaos subsided, Emily looked up and froze. Standing in the center of the room was a figure, its form cloaked in shadow. Its eyes burned like red-hot coals, and its presence radiated a palpable sense of malice. "Run," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. The group bolted, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they fled into the hallway. The creature didn't follow immediately, but its growl echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing moment. They ducked into one of the bedrooms, slamming the door shut behind them. Tom shoved a heavy dresser in front of the door, his hands shaking as he worked. "What do we do now?" Emily demanded, her voice rising in panic. "We can't fight that thing." "We don't have to fight it," Lucas said, holding up the book. "We just have to trap it, like they did before." "And how do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Lucas flipped to the page with the containment ritual, his eyes scanning the text. "We need a circle, salt, if we can find it, and we need to lure it inside." "That's insane," Tom said. "How are we supposed to lure it into a circle without getting killed?" Lucas didn't answer. He was already digging through his bag, searching for anything they could use. Emily grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Lucas," she said firmly, "we're not going to sacrifice anyone." "I'm not saying we should," Lucas said, "but if we don't do this, that thing will kill us all." The growl outside the door grew louder, and the walls trembled under the force of it. The creature was getting closer, its presence an oppressive weight that seemed to seep through the cracks in the wood. "Then we'd better hurry," Emily said, her voice grim. The group sprang into action, gathering supplies and drawing a makeshift circle on the floor with salt they had found in the kitchen. As they worked, the growling grew louder, the creature's shadow flickering in the hallway just beyond the door. When the circle was complete, Lucas stepped back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Now we just have to get it inside." "And how do you propose we do that?" Tom asked, his voice edged with fear. Lucas hesitated, then looked at Emily. "You said it was calling your name. It wants you." Emily's stomach dropped. "You want me too?" "It's the only way," Lucas said. "You have to lead it into the circle." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing that thing alone was almost too much to bear. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. As the others hid in the shadows, Emily stepped into the hallway, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The creature was waiting for her, its burning eyes fixed on her as it growled low in its throat, summoning every ounce of courage she had. She took a step forward. "Come on," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Come and get me." The creature roared, lunging toward her with terrifying speed. Emily turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she led it toward the circle. Behind her, the others waited, their breaths held as the plan unfolded. At the last moment, Emily dove out of the way, and the creature stepped into the circle. Lucas shouted the final words of the ritual, and the symbols on the floor glowed brightly, trapping the creature within. It howled in rage, thrashing against the invisible barrier, but it could not escape. For a moment, the group stood frozen, staring at the writhing figure inside the circle. Then, slowly, the glow faded, and the creature vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. The silence that followed the banishment of the creature was deafening. For a few long moments, no one moved, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as the weight of what had just happened settled over them. Emily sat on the floor, her back against the wall, staring at the faint, charred markings of the salt circle. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and she struggled to steady her breathing. "Is it gone?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucas knelt beside the circle, inspecting the faint glow that still lingered in the grooves of the wood. "I don't know," he admitted. "The ritual worked, but it didn't destroy it. It's contained for now, but not forever." Tom let out a bitter laugh, leaning heavily against the wall. "Great. So what do we do now? Just sit here and wait for it to come back?" "We need help," Emily said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She looked at Lucas. "You said this book was written by the people who trapped it before, right? There has to be someone out there who knows more about this." Lucas hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe, but we don't even know where to start." "I do," Emily said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. She unfolded it, revealing a phone number scrawled in messy handwriting. "The storekeeper. He warned us about this place. He gave us the herbs. Maybe he knows more." Tom frowned. "And how exactly are we supposed to call him? There's no phone reception out here." Lucas snapped his fingers, a spark of hope lighting his face. "The landline. I saw one in the kitchen earlier. If it still works, we can call him." Without waiting for a response, the group scrambled to their feet and made their way to the kitchen. The landline sat on a dusty counter, its rotary dial covered in cobwebs. Lucas picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. For a moment, there was only static. Then, faintly, he heard the steady tone of a working line. "It's alive," he said, relief flooding his voice. He quickly dialed the number Emily had given him, his fingers trembling as they turned the dial. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice crackled through the static. Hanson's General, the familiar, gravelly voice of the storekeeper answered. Lucas exhaled sharply. "It's us," he said quickly. "The group that went to Skogfjell Lodge. We need your help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When the storekeeper spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I told you not to go there." "We know." Lucas said. And you were right. Something's here. Something evil. We managed to trap it, but we don't know how long that will hold. Please, you have to help us. Another pause, then a heavy sigh. You're lucky I'm not far. Stay put. I'll be there by morning. The line went dead, leaving the group standing in tense silence. Lucas set the receiver down, his hands still shaking. He's coming, he said. By morning. Morning, Sarah repeated, her voice rising in panic. That's hours from now. What are we supposed to do until then? Stay alive, Emily said grimly. The hours that followed were some of the longest of their lives. The creature didn't reappear, but its presence lingered in the oppressive silence and the strange, cold energy that seemed to radiate from the walls. Shadows moved unnaturally at the edges of their vision, and faint whispers echoed through the halls, too soft to understand but impossible to ignore. Emily took the first watch, sitting by the fireplace with the book open in her lap. She couldn't read the language, but the illustrations told a chilling story. Page after page depicted rituals, sacrifices, and monstrous figures that seemed to leap off the page. One image in particular caught her attention, a drawing of the lodge itself, surrounded by jagged lines that pulsed with energy. Beneath it, a single word was scrawled in bold, red ink. Blood offer, she whispered aloud. What does it mean? Sarah asked, her voice startling Emily out of her thoughts. She had been sitting silently nearby, her knees drawn to her chest. I don't know, Emily admitted, but it's written everywhere in the book, on the walls, even in the markings in the basement. It has to mean something important. Blood offering, Lucas said suddenly, his voice heavy. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. That's what it means. Blood offer, blood sacrifice. Emily's stomach turned. You're saying it needs blood? Lucas nodded grimly. Not just any blood. Human blood. That's how they kept it contained before. No, Sarah said, shaking her head violently. We're not doing that. There has to be another way. Of course there's another way, Tom said firmly. We wait for the storekeeper. He'll know what to do. And if he doesn't? Lucas asked quietly. The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with dread. By the time dawn broke, the storm had finally begun to die down, the wind fading to a mournful whisper. The first rays of sunlight cast a pale glow over the snow-covered landscape, but the lodge remained cloaked in darkness, as if the light dared not touch it. The sound of an engine broke the silence, and the group rushed to the window. A battered old truck was making its way up the snow-covered road, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Relief washed over them as the truck came to a stop, and the storekeeper stepped out, bundled in a heavy coat and carrying a large canvas bag. They met him at the door, their words tumbling over each other in their desperation to explain what had happened. The storekeeper listened silently, his expression grim, before pushing past them into the lodge. Show me, he said simply. Lucas led him to the main hall, where the faint remnants of the salt circle still glowed on the floor. The storekeeper knelt beside it, his fingers tracing the charred markings. You're lucky you managed this, he said, his voice low. Most people wouldn't have made it this far. How do we stop it? Emily asked, her voice trembling. For good. The storekeeper stood, his eyes dark and weary. You don't, he said bluntly, not without a sacrifice. The words hit them like a blow, and for a moment, no one spoke. There has to be another way, Sarah said finally, her voice shaking. We can't do that. The storekeeper shook his head. This thing isn't just some ghost or spirit. It's ancient, older than this lodge, older than the mountains. The people who built this place made a pact with it, blood for power. When they stopped giving it what it wanted, it broke free. You trapped it, but the seal won't hold. Without a sacrifice, it'll come back, stronger. There has to be another way, Emily said firmly. There has to be. The storekeeper studied her for a long moment, then sighed. There might be, he said reluctantly, but it's dangerous. And if it fails, you'll wish you'd chosen the sacrifice. Tell us, Lucas said. The storekeeper hesitated, then reached into his bag, pulling out a bundle of dried herbs, a vial of dark liquid, and a worn, leather-bound journal. "This ritual might banish it permanently," he said, "but it requires all of you, and it'll fight back. If you're not strong enough, if your will falters even for a moment, it'll take you. All of you." The group exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, Emily stepped forward, her jaw set with determination. "We'll do it," she said. "Together." The storekeeper nodded. "Then let's begin." The year was 1989, and the winds howling through Norway's northern mountains carried with them the chill of forgotten secrets. For friends, Tom, Emily, Lucas, and Sarah sat huddled together in an old station wagon, the engine humming steadily as they made their way up the winding mountain road. Outside, the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the landscape in an eerie, pristine white. The journey had begun as a shared dream of adventure, a chance to escape the mundane routines of their daily lives. None of them could have guessed how profoundly it would reshape their world. "Almost there," Emily announced from the driver's seat, her gloved hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the tires crunched over the frozen ground. She had been navigating the increasingly treacherous road for hours, her breath fogging the windshield despite the heater blasting warm air. "Define almost," Tom grumbled from the passenger seat, his breath visible in the cold interior of the car. He adjusted his scarf and glanced nervously at the map spread out in his lap. "Because if we take another wrong turn, we'll end up as popsicles." "Relax," Lucas chimed in from the back seat, his voice brimming with excitement. He was the instigator of this trip, the one who had found the faded map at a flea market and convinced the others to join him. "The map says we are on the right track. Skogfjell Lodge should be just over the next ridge." "Assuming it still exists," Sarah murmured. She sat next to Lucas, her gaze fixed on the snowy wilderness beyond the fogged-up window. The world outside seemed impossibly still, as if holding its breath. "You did say it's been abandoned for decades, right? That's what makes it perfect." Lucas grinned, holding up a Polaroid camera. "Just think of the photos we'll get. Snow-covered mountains, eerie old architecture. It's going to be amazing." Tom shot him a skeptical look. "Amazing until we freeze to death because there's no heating. Would you stop being such a buzzkill?" Lucas shot back. "This is an adventure, the kind people write books about." The tension broke slightly as they crested the ridge, and the lodge finally came into view. It was a sprawling, shadowy structure perched precariously on the edge of a frozen cliff. Its steep, slanted roof was heavy with snow, and its windows stared blankly out at the landscape like the hollow eyes of a skull. Time had not been kind to the building. Its once grand exterior was now weathered and splintered, the paint peeling away to reveal the gray wood beneath. "Wow," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's beautiful. In a creepy sort of way." "Creepy is right," Tom muttered. "That place looks like it's straight out of a horror movie." "Exactly," Lucas beamed, undeterred. He was the first to leap out of the car, his boots sinking into the snow with a satisfying crunch. He turned back to the others, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Come on, we didn't drive all this way to sit in the car." Reluctantly, the others followed, their boots crunching over the icy ground as they approached the lodge. The cold was sharper here, biting through their layers of clothing as if the air itself resented their presence. Emily fumbled with the keys to the padlock on the front door, a relic of the lodge's last known caretaker. According to the scant information Lucas had managed to dig up, the lock fell away with a metallic clink, and the door creaked open, revealing a cavernous darkness within. The air that greeted them was stale and frigid, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and decay. "Well," Emily said, forcing a smile, "welcome to Skogfjell Lodge." Inside, the lodge was a ghost of its former self. The grand wooden beams that framed the ceilings were covered in cobwebs, and the once polished floorboards were now warped and uneven. Dust coated every surface, glittering faintly in the light of their flashlights. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main hall, its hearth cold and empty. Faded rugs lay scattered across the floor. their intricate patterns obscured by years of neglect. Lucas let out a low whistle. This place has character. It has tetanus, Tom countered, eyeing the rusted nails sticking out of the walls. Come on, it's not that bad. Lucas insisted, already snapping photos with his camera. The flash illuminated the room in brief, startling bursts, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Emily dropped her bag near the fireplace and rubbed her gloved hands together. Let's get a fire going before we all turn into icicles. As they worked to make the lodge livable, clearing away debris, setting up sleeping bags, and lighting the fire, the atmosphere began to shift. The flickering flames brought a fragile warmth to the room, and their laughter echoed off the wooden beams, momentarily dispelling the unease that had followed them since their arrival. But the shadows remained, lurking at the edges of the firelight, and the silence outside was absolute. It was as if the world beyond the lodge had ceased to exist, leaving them alone in a bubble of darkness and snow. The first night at Skogfjell Lodge began uneventfully, or so it seemed. After hours of unpacking, exploring, and attempting to make the lodge somewhat habitable, the group finally gathered around the fireplace to eat a modest dinner of canned soup and crackers. The fire crackled warmly, its orange glow painting soft shadows on the walls. For a moment, the lodge felt almost cozy, an oasis of warmth amidst the howling winds outside. This isn't so bad, Emily said, leaning back against a faded armchair. She stretched her legs out, her boots steaming slightly from the heat of the fire. Sure, it's a little creepy, but it beats being stuck in a boring dorm room. Exactly, Lucas chimed in, holding up his Polaroid camera. He snapped a picture of the group, the flash briefly illuminating their faces. We'll look back on this as the best trip we ever took. Sarah, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, smiled faintly but said nothing. Her gaze kept drifting toward the darkened hallway that led deeper into the lodge. Something about it unsettled her. How the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, almost alive. Tom, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Okay, so what's the plan for tomorrow, besides freezing to death? Lucas grinned. Explore. Of course. We'll check out every room, take some photos, maybe even find something cool. Who knows what's been left behind in this place? I don't know if I'd call it cool, Emily said, wrinkling her nose. Most of what we've seen so far is just old and broken. That's the charm, Lucas replied, undeterred. Abandoned places always have a story. We just have to uncover it. Tom shook his head, clearly unimpressed. Great. Just don't drag us into some cursed attic or something. The first sign that something was amiss came later that night. After dinner, the group decided to turn in early, exhausted from the long drive and the effort of settling in. The lodge had more than enough rooms, but no one wanted to sleep alone. They opted to spread out their sleeping bags in the main hall near the fireplace, where the warmth of the fire offered some comfort against the biting cold. As the fire burned low and the group drifted off to sleep, the lodge grew eerily quiet. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a suffocating stillness in its place. It was in this silence that Emily woke abruptly, her heart racing for no discernible reason. She sat up, her breath visible in the freezing air, and looked around. The fire had nearly gone out, its embers casting faint, pulsing light across the room. Tom, Lucas, and Sarah were still asleep, their forms bundled tightly in their sleeping bags. Everything seemed normal until Emily noticed the sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft scratching noise, like nails dragging against wood. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the hall, near the doorway to the kitchen. Emily froze, her senses on high alert. "Hello," she called out softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The scratching stopped immediately. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the sound resumed, closer this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if whatever was making it wanted to be heard. Emily's throat tightened. She reached over and nudged Tom, who stirred groggily. "What?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Listen," Emily hissed. Tom frowned but obeyed. At first, he heard nothing. Then his expression changed as the scratching sound reached his ears. His eyes met Emily's, wide and questioning. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before Emily could respond, the sound stopped again. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Then, without warning, a loud thud echoed through the hall, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Tom shot upright, fully awake now. "Lucas," he hissed, shaking their friend awake. Lucas groaned and sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "Listen," Emily said urgently. The group fell silent, straining their ears for any further noises. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came another thud, this one louder and closer, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor, slowly, methodically. "It's probably just the wind," Lucas said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "There's no wind," Sarah whispered. She was sitting up now, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the dark hallway. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stood. "I'm checking it out." "Are you insane?" Emily hissed. "What if it's—" "What? A ghost?" Tom interrupted, forcing a chuckle. "Come on. It's an old house. Things creak and settle. I'll just take a quick look." Before anyone could stop him, Tom clicked on the flashlight and headed toward the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust particles that hung in the air. The others watched anxiously as he disappeared around the corner. For a few tense minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then Tom's voice called out, "Guys, you might want to see this." The group hurried to join Tom, their flashlights casting overlapping beams of light as they entered the kitchen. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The room was as they had left it earlier, old, dusty, and cluttered with broken furniture. But then Tom pointed to the far wall. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were a series of markings, lines and symbols that none of them recognized. They looked almost deliberate, as if carved with intent, but there was no sign of what might have made them. "What the hell is this?" Lucas asked, stepping closer to inspect the markings. "Looks like runes or something," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Maybe Viking?" "Vikings didn't scratch creepy symbols into kitchen walls," Tom replied. "At least, not like this." Emily shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Let's just go back to the fire and forget about this. We can't just ignore it," Lucas argued. "This could be part of the lodge's history. It's fascinating. It's creepy," Sarah countered. "And it doesn't explain the noises we heard." As if on cue, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a loud crack, like wood splintering under pressure. The group jumped, their flashlights swinging wildly as they searched for the source. But there was nothing. The room was still, and the markings remained the only evidence of something unusual. Tom exhaled slowly. "Let's just go back to the fire. We'll deal with this tomorrow." Reluctantly, the group retreated to the main hall. But sleep didn't come easily. The scratching sounds didn't return that night, but the sense of unease lingered, wrapping around them like a second layer of cold. Morning came reluctantly to the mountains, the pale sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick layer of clouds that had settled over the lodge. The fire in the main hall had long since died out, leaving the group wrapped in their sleeping bags, shivering against the bitter cold. Emily was the first to wake, her breath visible in the freezing air as she sat up and rubbed her arms for warmth. "Morning already?" Tom groaned, rolling over onto his side. His face was pale, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. "Felt like I didn't sleep at all." "Me neither," Sarah muttered. Sitting up slowly, she looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the darkened hallway where the scratching noises had come from the night before. Did anyone else hear something strange? Like whispers? Lucas, who had been unusually quiet, nodded grimly. "Yeah, thought it was just my imagination." Emily frowned, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Okay, so we all agree this place is weird. Maybe we should." "No," Lucas interrupted, his tone firm. "We came here to explore, to figure out this lodge's story. And that's what we're going to do. Tom snorted. Right. Because creepy symbols and ghostly noises are so inviting. Lucas ignored him, grabbing his Polaroid camera and a flashlight. Let's check out the rest of the lodge. There's got to be more to this place than just a dusty old kitchen. Reluctantly, the others followed. The group moved cautiously through the lodge, their flashlights casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The air seemed heavier here, each breath feeling like an effort. As they explored, it became clear that the lodge wasn't just abandoned. It had been left in a hurry. Furniture lay overturned. Books and papers were scattered across the floors, and strange stains marked the walls in several places. As the group made their way down a narrow corridor, Emily suddenly froze. She thought she'd heard something, a faint sound, barely louder than the whisper of the wind. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Hear what?" Lucas asked, turning his flashlight toward her. "It sounded like someone calling my name." The group fell silent, straining their ears. For a moment, there was nothing but the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Then it came again, a soft, almost melodic voice, barely audible but unmistakable. "Emily." Emily's blood ran cold. The voice seemed to come from deeper within the lodge, echoing faintly through the hallways. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Okay, no," Tom said, grabbing her arm. "We're not doing this. We're going back to the main hall, and then we're leaving." "We're not leaving," Lucas insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. It could be the wind. Or, I don't know, something natural." "That didn't sound natural," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It sounded like a person. Whatever it is, we're not going toward it," Tom said firmly. "Emily, you okay?" Emily nodded, though her heart was still racing. "Yeah, let's just keep moving away from that sound." The group decided to explore the second floor, hoping to distract themselves from the unsettling voice. The staircase creaked ominously as they climbed, the sound echoing through the empty lodge. At the top, they found a long hallway lined with doors, most of which were slightly ajar. Lucas began snapping photos with his Polaroid camera, the flash illuminating the hallway in brief, stark bursts. As he shook the latest photo to develop it, he froze. "What is it?" Sarah asked, peering over his shoulder. Lucas held up the photo. In it, the hallway looked just as it did in real life, except for one detail. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a shadowy figure, its features indistinct but undeniably human-like. "What the?" Tom began, but Lucas cut him off. "It's probably just a trick of the light," he said quickly, though his voice wavered. "Dust or something." "Dust doesn't look like a person," Sarah said, her eyes wide. Lucas pocketed the photo, clearly unnerved. "Let's just keep going." As they explored one of the rooms, Sarah stumbled upon an old, leather-bound photo album lying on a dusty desk. The cover was faded, and the pages inside were brittle with age. Carefully, she began flipping through it. The photos inside were strange. Most were black and white images of the lodge in its prime, showing well-dressed guests gathered around the fireplace or sitting at lavishly set dining tables. But as she turned the pages, the photos began to change. The people in them grew less distinct, their faces blurry and unrecognizable. On the final page, there was only one photo, a group of people standing in front of the lodge. Unlike the earlier photos, this one was in color, but the faces of the people were blank, smooth, featureless ovals where their features should have been. "Guys," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "You need to see this." The others gathered around her, staring at the photo in silence. A cold dread settled over the room. "What the hell is this?" Emily whispered. Lucas shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." As the group returned to the main hall, Emily glanced toward one of the large windows overlooking the snowy landscape. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something move, a dark shape, almost human, standing just outside. "Did anyone else see that?" she asked, pointing toward the window. "See what?" Lucas asked, following her gaze. There was someone outside, Tom moved to the window, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, only the swirling snow and the faint outline of the trees beyond. "Probably just your reflection," Tom said, though his tone was uneasy. Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The fire had long since died out in the main hall, leaving the group huddled in darkness. The cold had crept in once again, clawing at their skin even beneath layers of blankets and jackets. None of them had slept well the previous night, haunted by the strange sounds and eerie shadows that seemed to seep from the very walls of the lodge. Yet as morning came, a grim determination had settled over them. Lucas, always the most adventurous of the group, insisted that they couldn't let their nerves ruin the trip. But even his usual bravado seemed tempered by the weight of the previous night. By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened unnaturally, casting an oppressive gloom over the lodge. Snow continued to fall in thick, suffocating waves, muffling every sound and cutting them off further from the world outside. Emily was the first to notice the unnatural stillness. She stood by the window, staring out at the endless expanse of white, her breath fogging up the glass. There was no wind, no movement in the trees, not even the faint rustle of snow settling on the roof. It was as if the world itself had frozen in time. "Guys," she said softly, her voice barely breaking the heavy silence. "Something feels wrong." Tom looked up from the fire he was attempting to rekindle. His hands were trembling slightly, whether from the cold or something else. He wasn't sure. "Everything about this place feels wrong. Be specific." Emily didn't respond immediately. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, squinting at the tree lean in the distance. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a dark figure standing motionless among the trees. She blinked, and it was gone. Shaking her head, she stepped away from the window. "Never mind," she muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's probably nothing." But the unease lingered, hanging over them like a suffocating fog. As the day wore on, the group tried to distract themselves by exploring more of the lodge. They found old, dust-covered furniture, faded paintings of somber-looking men and women, and a collection of books in a language none of them could read. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, Sarah discovered a porcelain doll sitting upright in a rocking chair, its cracked face frozen in a perpetual smile. She didn't touch it, but as she turned to leave the room, the chair creaked softly, as if moved by an invisible hand. Later that evening, as they gathered once more in the main hall, Lucas suggested they light the fireplace again to drive away the chill. He and Tom ventured into the basement to find more firewood, leaving Emily and Sarah alone upstairs. The basement was a sprawling, cavernous space, its walls lined with shelves of dusty jars and tools long since abandoned. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Lucas wrinkle his nose. "Smells like something died down here," Tom muttered, shining his flashlight around the room. "Charming," Lucas replied, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. He found a stack of logs near the far wall and began piling them into his arms. As he turned to leave, his flashlight beam caught something etched into the wall, a series of jagged symbols carved deep into the wood. They looked similar to the markings they had found in the kitchen, but these were more intricate, almost ritualistic. "Hey, Tom," Lucas called out, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Check this out." Tom approached reluctantly, his own flashlight sweeping over the carvings. "Great," he said flatly. "More creepy runes. Just what we needed." Lucas reached out to trace one of the symbols with his finger, but as soon as his skin made contact, a sharp, searing pain shot up his arm. He yelped, dropping the logs he was carrying and stumbling backward. "What the hell?" Tom demanded, grabbing his arm. "What happened?" "I don't know," Lucas gasped, clutching his hand. The skin where he had touched the wall was red and blistered, as if burned. It felt like something bit me. Tom didn't reply. He was staring at the wall, where the symbols seemed to shimmer faintly in the beam of their flashlights, as if alive. Without another word, he grabbed Lucas and pulled him back toward the stairs. Upstairs, Emily and Sarah were startled by the sound of footsteps pounding up from the basement. Lucas and Tom burst into the room, both pale and visibly shaken. "What happened?" Emily demanded, rushing to Lucas's side. "The basement," Tom said, out of breath. "There's something wrong with it. We shouldn't go down there again." Lucas didn't argue. He sank into one of the armchairs, cradling his injured hand. "This place, it's not just old. It's dangerous." The group sat in tense silence, the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling against the windows like a living thing. Sarah stared into the flames, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Do you think those symbols mean something?" she asked quietly. "Like a warning?" Lucas shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever this place was, it wasn't just a lodge. People did things here, bad things." As night fell, the oppressive atmosphere of the lodge seemed to grow heavier. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements unnatural and disjointed, as if they were cast by something other than the firelight. The group decided to sleep in shifts, unwilling to let the fire go out completely. Emily volunteered to take the first watch, sitting close to the hearth with a blanket draped over her shoulders. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The others had fallen into a fitful sleep, their breathing shallow and uneven. Emily's eyelids grew heavy, and she fought to stay awake. Just as she began to drift off, a sharp, metallic sound jolted her upright. She turned toward the source of the noise, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing. Then, in the dim light of the dying fire, she noticed the rocking chair in the corner of the room. It was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if rocked by an unseen hand. "Wake up," she whispered urgently, shaking Tom and Lucas awake. "Something's here." The group scrambled to their feet, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rocking chair had stopped moving, but the tension in the room was palpable. Then, from somewhere deep within the lodge, came a sound that made their blood run cold, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the halls like the rumble of distant thunder. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. They stood frozen, their breaths shallow, as the growl grew louder, closer. The lodge seemed to vibrate with the sound, the walls groaning as if under immense pressure. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flared violently, casting the room in an intense, blinding light. Just as quickly, it died down, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, Emily heard it again, the voice from earlier, soft and melodic, calling her name. This time, it was accompanied by a faint tapping at the window. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Outside the window, barely visible through the swirling snow, was the shadow of a figure. It stood motionless, its head tilted slightly to one side, as if watching them. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, chaos erupted.